Attachment theory was originally developed by John Bowlby, who began with the object relations theorist but moved to focus on attachment to other human beings as a fundamental need, as strong as any other drive. Bowlby thought that attachment has an instinctual basis and has great survival value. So his work is based on animal studies, including studies of imprinting in ducks, and importantly, Harlow's studies with rhesus monkeys that demonstrate profound effects of maternal separation on the development of young ones. Bowlby thought that attachment behaviors are goal-directed, so that these are behaviors that are aimed at what he called proximity seeking, seeking closeness to the attachment figure and maintaining that closeness. And attachment behaviors are also directed toward eliciting care, so they're purposeful. Bowlby said that we prefer certain attachment figures, usually those who are stronger, wiser, more capable than we are. And again, that has good survival value. And he described internal working models, which are cognitive and affective structures, mental structures. So this is similar to the internal mental representations that object relations theorists talked about, but Bowlby calls this the internal working model for attachment relationships. He said that early attachment models, early experience with our attachment figures, form patterns or templates for later relationships. So again, there's a parallel with object relations theorists who thought that our early object relations teach us a lot about the world and about human relationships, and that sets up a set of expectations going forward. But Bowlby is focused more explicitly on the early attachment model. He thought that caregivers can provide a secure base that's very important, not just for a sense of security on the part of the child, but as support for exploration and development. So this is reminiscent of Margaret Mahler's discussion of the practicing subphase, in which children go out and explore the world and come back to mom or an attachment figure for what she called emotional refueling. So they get a sense of care and confidence that helps them go out and explore further. So Bowlby is again saying that the secure base provided by a caregiver isn't just for security, it's also an important support for development. Mary Ainsworth was one of Bowlby's students who did a number of experiments in her lab with mothers and young children. And her experiments were called the strange situation experiments. She had the dyad in a lab, and then mom would leave, somebody else would come in, mom would come back. And there were 7 different phases in these experiments. And Ainsworth was videotaping them the whole time. And she looked at young children's responses to when mom left, when mom returned, when a stranger came in. And she coded those experiences in terms of whether or not the children displayed secure attachment to their mother. She found that most, 2/3 of children, did display a secure attachment to the mom. They protested when mom left and were glad to see her when she came back. And Ainsworth said that this was associated with maternal sensitivity to the infant's cues. So moms who were sensitive and responsive to their child had children who displayed a secure attachment style. Ainsworth classified 20% of the children in her studies as avoidant. These are children who would avoid mom when she returned into the room. Ainsworth thought this was associated with maternal rejection or neglect. She classified 12% of the children in her studies as angry or resistant. Nowadays we call this attachment style anxious ambivalent. Ainsworth thought that this was a product of inconsistent care. She said that these attachment styles also relate to behavior that occurs in the home, relate to children's attempts at problem solving, at self-confidence, and at empathy for others for up to 5 years. Bronfenbrenner criticized Ainsworth's work, saying that much of what is known about development is based on the study of strange behaviors in strange situations. And he was concerned that this strange situation experiment didn't really mirror what goes on in the real world. Building on Ainsworth's work, we have identified a series of different attachment patterns or styles. And these styles are thought to develop in infancy. There are two main categories: secure attachment and insecure attachment. So secure attachment is a strong bond to a consistent object, and we think this develops in about 2/3 of all children worldwide. So there have been many studies of attachment styles across culture, and it appears that across cultures, 2/3 of children demonstrate secure attachment to one or more caregivers. Insecure attachments are also strong bonds. These are not weak bonds. These are strong bonds, but to inconsistent or distant objects. So these are bonds in which there is a fair amount of anxiety. The secure attachment style is different from insecure in that secure attachments aren't characterized by a lot of anxiety about the relationship. Anxiety is present in insecure attachments, and there are 3 types of insecure attachments. Anxious ambivalent attachments are associated with inconsistent care, and they can appear in terms of compulsive caregiving on the part of the child. So the child who is anxious and unsure about her relationship with a caregiver might herself try to take care of the parent. Another insecure style is termed anxious avoidant. This is associated with distant or neglectful care, could be due to maternal depression or substance abuse. And this style can be seen sometimes in terms of compulsive self-reliance on the part of the child. So the child has learned that caregiving is minimal and she must rely on herself. The third insecure attachment style is called disorganized, and it is a blend of the ambivalent and avoidant types. This has been called reactive attachment disorder, but is associated with severe abuse and neglect in childhood. So an attachment behavior is anything done to elicit care, to establish or maintain proximity to an attachment figure. And these attachment behaviors are flexible, they're complex, and they're contingent, meaning that they depend on what's going on in the environment. So what are some of these behaviors? Well, what do infants and young children do to elicit care or establish or maintain proximity? They smile, they laugh, they giggle, they cry, they touch other people. These are all attachment behaviors. You could say they're attention-getting, but it's more than that. They're aimed at eliciting care. Attachment theorists believe that these attachment behaviors become organized around 6 to 12 months of age. They're organized in that kids learn that smiling produces a certain reaction. Different kinds of cries produce different kinds of responses. And initially, around 9 months of age, when an attachment figure leaves the room, most children will protest. But in the second, third, and fourth years of life, children show less distress in response to separation. They become better able to weather that separation, whether that's through a transitional object or not. They become less dependent on attachment figures. And in the third and fourth year, we see that children are less egocentric, less self-centered, and more verbal in their communication with caregivers about their wants and needs. So overall, proximity needs decrease over time. Children are not as insistent on closeness to caregivers, but the attachment system is activated under stress. So what does that mean? Well, over time, children can tolerate more distance from a caregiver. They can tolerate the caregiver's absence more smoothly. But when they're stressed, when they're sick, when they're hurt, when they're upset, they protest and look for an attachment figure. Okay, so they want to go back to that secure base when stressed. There's some studies of attachment styles and attachment behavior in adulthood. We think that attachment is a lifelong developmental process. It's not something that just happens in the first few years of life. Attachment patterns can change over time with different experiences. There's also more reciprocity in adult attachments compared with our early attachments, where children are attached to stronger, wiser, more capable figures who can do things for us. There's more of an equal exchange in adult relationships. And adult attachment styles have been studied most notably by Marjorie Main. So Main gives names to 4 attachment styles that have parallels with the early attachment styles. So the early style called secure attachment, Main calls autonomous in adulthood. So adults with autonomous attachments are not entirely separate beings, and they're not trouble-free, but they have a realistic view of their own past and a relative absence of anxiety about relationships. Avoidant attachments in childhood, what are sometimes called anxious avoidant attachments, become dismissive attachments in adulthood. Now here Main thinks that children who have had distant or neglectful care tend to avoid closeness to caregivers, and the style is called dismissive in adulthood because she thinks these adults dismiss both their early experiences in relationships and the importance of relationships in the present tense. So these are attachment styles that are characterized by minimizing attachment issues. Ambivalent attachment in early childhood becomes, according to Main, preoccupied attachment in adulthood. So while ambivalently attached children were anxious about their inconsistent relationships with caregivers, in adulthood this would appear as preoccupation, over-involvement, obsession about relationships, or, as Main said, maximizing attachment issues. And then finally, the attachments that were classified as disorganized in early childhood are referred to as unresolved or fearful in adulthood. There are some interesting cultural differences in attachment styles. So Rothman and colleagues found that 2/3 of children have secure attachments across cultures, Eastern and Western cultures, but there are differences in terms of insecure attachment styles. So this research team found more avoidant or independent attachments in Western cultures and more ambivalent or dependent patterns in Eastern cultures. They found that sensitivity, maternal sensitivity in particular, leads to secure attachment across cultures, but there are cultural differences in how sensitivity is expressed. And there are different antecedents of insecure attachment. They found that social competence, the sense of social and emotional skills, comes from secure attachment, but what counts as social competence depends on culture. So what is viewed as social competence, social emotional competence in Eastern cultures is not the same as what's viewed as social emotional competence in the West. Across cultures, a secure base does appear to support exploration. But there are differences in behaviors that relate to attachment, so that in the US, we emphasize exploration and autonomy. We encourage children to go out and play with objects in preschool, while in Japan, there's emphasis on dependence, on attachment figures and others, and accommodation to others' needs. So attachment styles are clearly influenced by culture. Rothman and another set of colleagues wrote an interesting paper on attachment and amai. So amai in Japan refers to expectations of indulgence and interdependence. This is what's expected of caregivers. They should indulge their children and should encourage what we might think of as dependence, what is considered interdependence in Japan. In the US, again, there's more emphasis on exploration associated with security. There's also more anger or aggression associated with insecurity in children. In Japan, security is linked with accommodation. Inappropriate behavior is linked with a need for security and interdependence, or amai. So let's think about the biological bases of attachment. Attachment is no longer thought to be purely instinctual. Attachment probably results from co-actions of biology, that is genes, hormones, neural networks, and environment, including diet and social relationships. There are sensory motor, thermal, and nutrient influences on evolving social bonds as well. So the bases of attachment are complex. They're biological, psychological, and social. Relational security, or the secure base, promotes affect regulation, an aspect of ego functioning. So when we feel that we have a secure base in our caregivers, that helps us regulate our emotional states. Here are some criticisms of attachment theory. First, there's fairly little prospective longitudinal research. So although Main and others speculate that attachment styles that develop in infancy carry over into similar styles in adulthood, there are really very few studies that have traced this prospectively. Instead, we have some retrospective studies that talk with adults about their early childhood experiences, and some cross-sectional studies that just look at one or a couple of points in time. That doesn't really tell us much about how attachment remains stable or changes over time. So stability and change in attachment patterns is not well documented. There are few cross-cultural studies of attachment. The Rothman studies are exceptions to this. And there may be some overinterpretation of animal studies. So many of the lessons that we think we've learned from animal studies are applied to human beings as if animals are adequate models for human attachment and human relationships. That's called anthropomorphism, which means seeing human forms in animals, and may be incorrect. And like many of the other theories we've studied so far, attachment theory has focused a lot on mothers. It assumes that there are two-parent families and that children are raised by heterosexual couples, which is, of course, not always the case. It is interesting to note that there are no gender differences in attachment patterns in the research. Also, attachment theory has focused on single attachments and not on multiple attachments or attachments to more than one caregiver. And that's unfortunate because we know from what little empirical research there is on this that attachments to different parents are not highly correlated. So children can display one attachment style to one figure and a different style to another figure. And so which attachment style does the child have? we tend to characterize the child's attachment style in relation to one caregiver. But, of course, many children have multiple caregivers. There isn't a lot of attention to attachments to siblings and others besides caregivers, but clearly siblings and cousins and friends and other relatives, other important figures early on are important in the lives of children. There's also some lack of clarity about key concepts. It's relatively clear, to me at least, about what attachment means in infancy. We talk about attachment behaviors as purposeful behaviors aimed at eliciting care and proximity. And we talk about attachment styles in relation to different caregiving experiences. It's less clear what attachment means in adulthood. Are we talking about romantic relationships, friendships, acquaintances, relationships with people at work or school? All of the above? It's less clear. Let's think about how attachment theory is used in social work. It draws attention to the importance of maternal sensitivity and responsiveness to children's cues. It suggests that environmental influences on the qualities of maternal care are very important. And this provides support for the idea that caregivers need care themselves, they need respite, they need education, they need resources in order to provide sensitive and responsive care for children. Attachment theory can be used in assessment. For instance, some clinicians assess a client's attachment patterns or styles. And attachment theory can be used in treatment. For example, the treatment is seen as another opportunity to provide a secure base for exploration of ideas, thoughts, feelings, desires, wishes, and so on. And attachment theory also can inform and influence social policy, suggesting, for example, that policy ought to support safe and stable home environments for children, for example, in child welfare. Because if early attachment is so important in developing sort of blueprints for relationships later in life, then we really do have to care about the environments in which children are born into and grow in.